Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellen Hoobler. I am the William B. Ziff Jr. Associate Curator for Art of the Americas here at the Walters Art Museum. And today, our program is a talk with filmmakers Jesse Lerner and Sandra Rosental in conjunction with the museum's exhibition, Translations and Transitions, or Traducciones y Transiciones, a celebration of Mexican and Central American independence 1821 to 2021. I should just say that support for the Walters is made possible through the combined generosity of individual donors, foundations, corporations, and grants from the City of Baltimore, the Maryland State Arts Council, citizens of Baltimore County and Howard County Government, and Howard County Arts Council. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel and Facebook page after we conclude tonight's program. We invite you to type questions, and they can be in English or en Español, into the chat box if you have questions. So let's go ahead and just get started. Tonight, we are joined by, I'm very excited to talk to Jesse Lerner and Sandra Rosental. Jesse Lerner is a documentary filmmaker, curator, and writer based in Los Angeles. He has made numerous short films and documentaries, including Natives, Magnavos, Frontierland, Ruins, and of course, The Absent Stone, which we'll be talking about tonight. All of those have won prizes at film festivals in the US, Latin America, and Japan, and have been screened at museums around the world, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Reina Sofia in Madrid, the Guggenheim Museums in New York and Bilbao, among many others. We also have with us Sandra Rosental, a cultural anthropologist whose research explores national patrimony and heritage claims based on the removal of archaeological objects from local communities for the purpose of state making. She has worked as a researcher and curator for museums and cultural institutions in Mexico, often collaborating with artists and curators. She's also an associate professor in the Humanities and Social Sciences Division of the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Coajimalpa in Mexico City, and there she teaches on museums, collections, science, art, and film. Very excitingly, Sandra has a new book out this fall, co-edited with Maruna Akim and Susan Dean Smith. It's entitled Museum Matters, Making and Unmaking Mexico's National Collections. So please look for that from University of Arizona Press out this fall. Very exciting. Welcome, Sandra and Jesse.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And for any people who have not been able to see this important and fun documentary, which is called The Absent Stone or La Piedra Ausente, I'd like to emphasize once again, this is a fully bilingual movie, documentary film. Anytime when somebody is speaking Spanish on screen, there will be English subtitles. And by contrast, when they're speaking English, there will be Spanish subtitles. So that's one of the things I find very satisfying about it, is this complete bilingual quality to it. It is available right now on the virtual Parkway Theater virtual platform. Maybe we can put I'm sure that the link for that has already been, is on the Walters website, and maybe we can drop that into the chat as well. And I urge you to watch this documentary. It tells in a really entertaining and engaging way the story of how a monumental stone statue of a rain god made centuries ago was taken from its town of origin in central Mexico in 1964 to stand in front of the newly constructed Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. So for a second, let's just take a look at this. Here we have this monolith from the town of Cuatlinchan, recently installed in front of the Museum of Anthropology, a photo by Nacho Lopez of 1964. And we've gotten a little ahead of ourselves. So I urge you to watch this film. It talks about how when the federal government offered the town of Cuatlinchan different incentives to remove the statue and have it in front of the museum, the town was ultimately convinced by the federal government's offering different incentives. But when it came time to actually remove the monolith, there was civil unrest, and the townspeople punctured the tires of the trucks sent to move it, and there were threats on both sides. Ultimately, the army was sent to restore order. The statue was removed, and today, as you can see from this photo and others, here we go. This monolith stands today in front of the museum on the Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City, almost as a billboard for the museum. The film is about the continuing veneration of the statue by some individuals in the town and the ways that it has inspired the townspeople to continue to interrogate and appreciate their own Indigenous past. So we're going to go ahead and jump forward. My first question for both of you, and we will certainly open this up for questions for our viewers as well, but my first question is, how did this topic come to your attention? The story of this monumental figure from Coatlinchan, which has been in front of the National Museum since 1964. And I hope I'm on the right slide now. We can move forward as we need to.
Well, actually, this is a good slide to start with, because I think that this photograph was actually the image that sparked my interest, at least in this story. This image is a photograph from 1964, when this object was being moved from the town in Coatlinchan in the Texcoco municipality to Mexico City's Anthropology Museum. And I was working at the museum in the early 2000s, when the museum was being renovated, and there was a catalog that was published for the 40th anniversary of the museum. And I had experience working in community museums in Oaxaca, and I knew some of these spaces in different parts of Mexico. And as an anthropologist, had already kind of come across a lot of the debates and fraught claims that a lot of these objects and monuments had sparked in local communities. So I was really surprised to see that in the 40th anniversary catalog that was commemorating the history of this museum, the movement of this object was framed as this kind of triumphal state-making endeavor. And the plaque that was placed in the fountain where this monument stood said that it had been generously donated by the townspeople of Coatlinchan to the nation. And I was kind of suspicious of this narrative to begin with. And also, this was a time, we will get a chance, I think, to talk more about this later, but this was a time in the early 2000s where so much of the literatures that were coming out of post-colonial studies and museum studies and history of museums and collections were looking at these moments of dispossession and the expropriation of artifacts for museum collections, and the politics and politics of representation of all of this very critically. And there had been in the 90s the passing of the legal frameworks in the US and in other settler colonial contexts that were thinking in terms of repatriation and returning some of these objects, that it was really quite surprising to me to find in 2004 that this story was being narrated as this kind of triumphal gift that this town was making to the nation. So I framed my research. Well, first I went there, and I was then doing a PhD in anthropology at New York University, where I was very lucky to work with people like Fred Myers and others who were interested in museum collections and the appropriation of indigenous objects, forms of knowledge, and aesthetics in different national contexts. He works on Australia, but this really inspired me to think about a project that would explore how these objects were being, how the history of these objects becoming museum objects was being lived and experienced in the communities that they came from. And so originally I designed a project that was also inspired by your work, Ellen, actually, because my idea was to do a project that would explore different contexts. So I was going to do a project in Oaxaca on community museums where objects had remained in the community, in museums that were curated and run by communities in these very local contexts. And I was going to do a project, and another object that I wanted to study was the famous Señor de las Limas in Veracruz. That's in a state museum rather than a national museum, and has its own really fascinating history of how it was found in a community by kids and then venerated as a Catholic virgin, and then finally taken to this state museum, even though the National Museum wanted it, and there was a whole sort of back and forth around that. And finally, I had chosen the story of the Coatlinchan monolith because I had seen this picture many years ago and thought it was really quite astounding. So I started the project going to Coatlinchan because it's close to where I live. It's only 35 miles east of Mexico City. And just going there and seeing some of what you will see in the film of all of the different replicas and ways that this object is still so present in the community, despite almost 50 years of not actually being there and having been removed as this national heirloom, completely fascinated me. And so I never ended up doing the other projects. Hopefully somebody will, because I think it would have been really interesting to do that comparison. But my project of a multi-sided fieldwork project never happened. So that's how I became interested in the story.
Oh, how fascinating. That's wonderful. I have to say the multi-sided field research sounds very, very ambitious, but that is in keeping with your intellectual rigor and dedication to your subject, which is great. What about you, Jesse? How did you become aware of this? How did you and Sandra link up in this?
Well, I think, my point of entry was probably a little different from Sandra's. I'd done a couple films previously, some of which deal with Mesoamerican objects and the way in which they've circulated. And one of them is really sort of modeled on the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. And I'd certainly been, following some of those debates that Sandra was referencing and reading Fred Myers and some of the, conversations about colonial loot and repatriation. And I mean, objects like you mentioned, the Las Limas sculpture, right? That got kidnapped and was taken to Texas and found behind some motel room. So stories like that always, kind of fascinate me. And I was invited to New York sometime when Sandra was in the middle process of her doctoral work. I guess you hadn't started your field work, but you were like doing qualifying exams or something like that. I was invited to New York to show all of my films in this kind of mid-career survey at the Anthology Film Archives. And coincidentally, Sandra and I had just published articles in the same publication for a mutual friend, for a catalog, an exhibition catalog at the Carrillo Hill Museum. So she emailed me and said, I'm starting this interesting research in Coatlinchan, and I'd been to the Anthropology Museum probably millions of times, but hadn't really spent that much time thinking about the Coatlinchan monument. So she invited me to her fieldwork site and went there and said, we should make a film. This is a great story. And I was convinced. And since she was living there full time and I was teaching full time here in Los Angeles, I did more of, the kind of fly down on Thursday night, shoot on Friday and Saturday, fly back on Sunday and teach on Monday. So I had less of that kind of long-term engagement with the community, but I got to know many of the people that you see in the film and develop some kind of relationship. And I guess, maybe we could talk about this later if it's interesting to people, but, I think having the camera there also kind of changed the dynamics of the field work. And I'm coming from Hollywood with a big film camera, so that's definitely going to impact the dynamic somehow.
Yeah, I feel like there's parts where that's evident, and then there's parts where there's so much intimacy with the people, which kind of leads me to my second question. I'm gonna go through some of the slides that we have today to kind of show some evidence about how this particular figure, and maybe Jesse, you teach, where do you teach in LA? We're just getting a question there, and we'll answer the other question later on.
I teach in the Intercollegiate Media Studies program at the Claremont Colleges, which is actually not in LA. It's LA County, but Claremont, California, about 35 miles east of here.
Great. And just, I always love to answer some of the, very specific questions very quickly, but this brings up this question of the people of Coatlinchan, and I'm really interested to know more about the sculpture, its place in both the collective memory of the town, but then also how it starts to become really a national monument. We're going to go through some of these slides to illustrate what I think you're going to talk about, that show it becoming nationally seen and recognized. But tell us a little bit about your experience of beginning to meet and talk to the people of Coatlinchan about the statue. How did you explain your interest in the topic? And then how did they decide to trust you with the story? Because I think the film makes so clear that you clearly formed these incredibly strong bonds with people in the town. They were willing to open their homes and talk to you very, very intimately about this. So I'm going to just show a few of these slides.
I think the next slide and the following one speak to kind of if you want, leave the first one. Speak to this first aspect of your question. I think the reason why I kind of never ended up going anywhere else and really working on this object is partially explained by this. So this object, this monument, when it gets moved to the museum, starts acquiring all sorts of different significances and importance way beyond the Museum of Anthropology and the archaeological collections that are concentrated there. And that was one of the things that really fascinated me. So here you can see ads from the 1960s and 70s where it is being used as not just a symbol of Mexican sort of ancient past, but also of its modernity. So we see it advertising watches next to the Torre Latinoamericana. That was sort of Mexico's Empire State Building, also from the 1950s, this kind of, modern cityscape that it kind of becomes a part of as another building. And we see it on the other slide as already becoming an object that could be reproduced as a monument in different contexts. So here, there's one shot of a replica that's quite famous in the Avenida Revolución in Tijuana that Jesse took in 2012. So there's replicas of this object as a kind of heritage object, but also it kind of started popping up in all sorts of other places that also connected it to ideas of Mexican modernity. So the image from the postcard is from the Friendship Dam, which was a very important project that was done in the 1960s also between the Mexican and US government as this huge infrastructure project. And it's not the only one. If you see the film, you'll see several of these gigantic replicas that were placed in dams, kind of using a pre-Hispanic rain deity to power Mexican modernity, which I really thought was fascinating. So this particular object, because of its association with the museum and with all of the technology and engineering that was required to move it, started becoming kind of an icon of 1960s Mexico, not just of the past. So that was one of the things that made it particularly interesting. And I did a lot of archival work to kind of piece together some of this and find some of these images. Here there's a comic book that was also published in 1964, telling the whole story of this monuments movement and the relationship with the community, but all in comic book. And you'll see some of these images in different parts of the film. We really were inspired by this comic in also thinking about the use of animation and humor in the film, and we'll go back to talking about that a little bit later. But another element that also really sparked my interest in working in more detail around this object is this slide, which is that although the museum has this plaque that says that this object was donated generously by the community to the nation, and in the film you can see one of the engineers that was in charge of the project, who unfortunately passed away last year, saying that, you know, there was no contratiempos. How do you say that? That there was no delays and no problem, and everything went really smoothly. When I started doing some of the research in the newspapers from the time period, it turned out that all of the national newspapers had on their front pages, I mean, it was not a hidden story, there was not much censorship, this was everywhere, that there had been a rebellion in the town, and that the whole project of these engineers to move this sculpture had been sabotaged by community members, and this was narrated in all sorts of different language. So a lot of the bylines in the newspapers said that people were superstitious and had all kinds of beliefs that this object would take away, that if this object was removed, rain would stop in the community. Some of them focused on issues of property, saying that there had been a deal that was not fulfilled by the Mexican state of exchanging this statue for a school, a clinic, and a bunch of infrastructure for the community. There were different ways that this story was being told. So I became very interested in this rebellion and how it was remembered by the people in Coatlinchan. So I went to Coatlinchan in 2004, and this is a still from our film. And this is what you would see if you went to Coatlinchan today, with a few modifications. Maybe now the blue facade is pink, or, you know, but this is pretty much what you would see in the town's main square. When I went to Coatlinchan in 2004, this replica was not there. There was a kiosk that looked much like most Mexican village kiosks, where somebody was selling fruit smoothies and tacos, and so the replication of this object was present in other places. I saw other replicas in people's homes, some of the things that you'll see in the film. But this particular life-size replica began being built in 2005. So I first went to Coatlinchan curious to see what there was, and found all of these sort of little references to the stone, and people were talking about it very easily. But the next year, when I actually got a grant to do my preliminary dissertation work under Tom Abercrombie, this was under construction. And so this was a real opening also for talking to people about this object, because it was being built right then and there as I started to do my field work. So it was really around the building of this replica that I got to know a lot of the people that you'll see in the film, and that became kind of the key informants, and I would also say my friends in Coatlinchan, because this thing was being built, and it was just easy to go up to the people that were around it and ask them about it, and they would refer me to the school teacher, to Maestra Lupe Villarreal, or they referred me to the group of people working in the Calpuy and Macoyolotzin. At the time, it was called Grupo Cultural, and then there was a split, and there were several groups of people that were invested in the town's history and patrimony, and everybody was working around this replica. So that was a really good in terms of starting the project. And eventually, I moved to Coatlinchan to do my long-term fieldwork project, and started. I lived there for almost 14 months, and started just doing very traditional anthropological fieldwork, talking to people, interviewing people. But there was that I still didn't know I was going to make a film. So the film was not something that was discussed. As I mentioned earlier, I went to NYU that has a visual anthropology program, so I was very familiar with ethnographic film and interested in ethnographic film. I had studied with Faye Ginsburg and others in that program. But I never thought that I would make a film. It was really by meeting Jesse and talking to him about this project that making a film kind of became a possibility. And collaborating with him allowed me to debut as a filmmaker, which was awesome. I think that that people were, in a way, very open to the film once it became a project, because I had already lived in Coatlinchan. I think we started filming, I think I had already lived there for 9 or 10 months when Jesse was able to come with a camera. Also, Jesse came first without a camera, and just hung out there to meet people and kind of get a sense of the place and of how people would feel about making the film. And in many ways, I mean, this isn't surprising. I think this is something that a lot of people in visual anthropology have experienced, that in a way, making the film kind of made my project a lot more understandable to a lot of the people in Coatlinchan. I think before that, there were even rumors that I was a spy. There were I mean, these are common tropes, right? Well, because it's difficult for people to understand what you're doing. I mean, first of all, you don't have a job. I mean, they don't see you as having a job, and you're just sort of showing up in all of these places and asking questions and living there. And, in my case, I look like a gringa. Jesse looks like a Latino, and I look like a gringa. So there were all sorts of ways that it was unclear what I was doing there. And suddenly it was like, oh, you're making a movie. Okay. And what was really wonderful is that once we started filming, I think Jesse can talk a little bit about this as well, there was all of these ways in which people got really engaged and worked with us as collaborators in setting up a lot of the shoots. So somebody would come and say, oh, you have to interview this person in this house because it's really cool. And so suddenly certain spaces in the community were open to us as locations for filming. And Jesse said this earlier, that the filming process also really changed the anthropological research that I was doing as fieldwork, because there were certain things that were difficult. So there's a whole scene in the film where people from the Calpuli bring up and reconstruct a model of the pre-Hispanic town of Coatlinchan. And I had known that model existed for years. I had even seen it on one of the visits that I did when they were showing it, but it had been stored in somebody's basement for several years by the time I actually was able to go and live and do my field work. And it was just not going to happen. They were not going to take this out for me to talk about for an interview. But for the film, it was really fascinating to have them be interested and willing to take this out, reconstruct it, talk about the process of making it, all in the process of filming. So I was able to use that for my research in ways that I would have never been able to do. The same goes for these expeditions that are shot in the film. They had organized for years expeditions every weekend to go to the different sites around the community where there were pre-Hispanic ruins. Yeah. And this is something that I had, again, heard about, but by the time I got there, they were done with that. Right. So with the film, suddenly they recreated it for us, for the film. And that's obviously something that I talk about in my writing, but it was one way to do research that I hadn't really thought about in all of these recreations that they did for the film. So it was actually really a fascinating research tool to be working on this project. But people, I think, were really open to letting us shoot, because in many ways this didn't start off as a film. We didn't show up with a camera in the first place. They had known me for years and had known me under all of these other rubrics. And suddenly I think it made a lot of sense that this film was happening. I think also they related to Jesse in really interesting ways. Of course, there was also gender issues where suddenly they were willing to talk to Jesse about stuff that they wouldn't have necessarily been as easygoing with me because he's a guy, things like that.
No, I think that was definitely a factor with the maqueta. But I guess three things that I'd want to add to what Sandra said. I mean, because she started with these advertisements that incorporate the image, and most of the film is stuff that we shot, but I think it really enriched the film that there was all this archival material, not just the traslado, the transport from Coatlinchan to the museum, but advertisements and the comic book and all this kind of pop culture stuff. I think really enriched the film, and in doing that research, then you just keep on turning up more and more and more. The second thing I wanted to add was in terms of like our engagement during the filmmaking process with the community. I think when I was studying documentary, there was a real, my teachers were maybe more old school observational cinema people, and they emphasized that you should film the things that people would be doing anyway, even if you weren't there, right? And some of the things, even if we hadn't been there with the camera, right, they still would have been a replica, and they still would have been the, Yankees and so on and so forth. But there are other things that we really provoked, right? The whole scene with the municipal orchestra where they march through the street. That's not something that they do. In fact, somebody had composed that music and passed away and left the sheet music in a box in a closet. And it was really sort of our provocation, or our suggesting that, let's take out this music and arrange it and get musicians together and perform it for the camera. There was stuff that wouldn't have happened if it
had been forgotten. Most people, I think only the son of the composer still knew it. So he got together a bunch of his father's friends that were still alive, and they recreated and repieced together from memory what they remembered of this song so that it could be performed for our film.
So you wouldn't necessarily know that from watching the movie, but there is this kind of observational footage of things that would have happened anyway, even if we hadn't been there with the camera, and then other things that the camera and the filmmakers kind of provoke or had to set into motion. And then
this is something Jesse has thought a lot about and written books about as well, if anybody's interested in thinking about recreation and fake documentary and verite and all of that.
And I guess the third thing I would add, just in terms of the community relations and the film, is, and I guess Sandra mentioned this in passing, when we finished, we did a premiere in the town square, and we, rented this big inflatable screen and projected it twice. So not just in terms of explaining what it is that Sandra was doing there if she isn't the spy, but, what is, the point of hanging out there for all that time and asking all those questions. But it's also kind of this, that you return something, as well as taking something, taking images, taking stories, but you also like give it back, and it then becomes something for the community to share.
And if anybody's interested in seeing some footage of that premiere, we have a short documentary on our website that shows the premiere of the film the day of this. We premiered it actually simultaneously in the town and in a film festival. So that was something that was also very important to us.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's absolutely.
And so that's on our website. I can share the link in a second.
Great. That would be wonderful. I mean, I lingered on this image of Doña María de la Luz, Trujano Garcia, for so long, only because I think it really brought out, to some degree, Sandra, like how different this would have been. This woman had so much to say, and you can kind of see, I don't know if people can see my cursor, that in between this, Our Lord of Sorrows and other religious figures and stuffed animals, there is a replica. But I just, in a written anthropological account, this can come across as dry, but she was so filled with life. But I think it also just opens a door to talk about something else. Jesse, or for both of you, your decision to bring this to life in another way, which was to incorporate animation, mostly in scenes without dialogue, and for these sections, especially that give a background to the historical context, the ancient context of the statue. It kind of recalls Monty Python, but at the same time, these are not just cartoons. Some of them are cartoons, but others are figures from picture manuscripts, either from the indigenous past of Mexico. Let's see, I guess here we have some of this, or 16th century, early colonial manuscripts and figures in that style. So can you tell us about the decision to incorporate that animation in this? That was really fascinating.
Yeah, I guess one way to, sort of start to answer that question would be, just in very pragmatic terms, right? Maybe 75% of the film we shot either in Coatlinchan or in Mexico City or in Texas or where have you. And maybe there's another 15% or so that's archival imagery, and some of that captures things that we weren't going to get a chance to shoot, right? Because in 1964 they moved it, and they're not going to move it again. But somebody was there with a camera, so let's use that archival material. And then there's another 10% of things that we wanted to incorporate into the narrative, if that's the right word, of the film, but that we knew, there wasn't going to be archival material for. And then you're kind of confronted with, this challenge, right? If we're not going to shoot it and we're not going to find the archival material, yet we do think it's important to talk about, and there are 3 animated sequences, and each one we can talk about individually, right? But the first one referring to this, sort of account from the early part of the 16th century, where it's reported that Montezuma had asked for this very big stone to be brought to Tenochtitlan, and the stone didn't want to go. And it's not clear. It's not necessarily the same stone, but it does have, the authoritarian figure of the Mexica emperor has certain echoes in the authoritarian figure of the priest, the president of the 20th century, and the capital is in the same place. And this idea of moving a big stone by imperial decree or by central authority says so. So
the way Tatuani.
Yeah. So to just kind of play with that parallel without doing something really kind of dry and didactic, like an intertitle. Did you know that in the, account of the conquest, there's this interesting anecdote,
Or a talking head with an expert kind of telling us the story.
So to sort of reconstruct that and not say, that this is the monolith from Quatlinchan that was being brought and then returned under its own volition, but to do it in a more sort of playful, suggestive way that, you then come back to after you've seen the film and maybe think about more in the context of everything else you've seen, and it creates these echoes or this reverberance, that seemed like a productive kind of strategy to pursue. And we worked with this collective of animators called the Viewmasters that, brainstormed and gathered the iconography, and, then it's just sort of frame by frame, right? It's the old school. I think that's the Monty Python reference, right? That it's not digital animation, but rather it's moving around little pieces of photocopies. Or
one particularly,
we also used the animations as a way to kind of mine our archive. So there was so much material that I had found in various archives. Like this image, for example, that was created for the animations by the Viewmasters is combining 1960s maps of the city with photographs of what was going on at the time. And a lot of the characters are from actual photographs of the day that the monolith was brought to Mexico City. So we did this kind of collage and layering with some of the archive that just wasn't, we couldn't put everything in the film. So this was a way that we could reference a lot of these materials and use them in a creative and exciting way.
And with this last one, right before the final credit roll, essentially it's the repatriation, right? And that's not something we're going to be able to shoot because it's probably not ever going to go back to Quatlinchan. And you could take footage of the transport from Quatlinchan to Mexico City from 64 and run it backwards. And there's a little bit of that incorporated into this last sequence, but it's more than that, right? It's like kind of taking it back to the place of origin, and, it's hypothetical, or it's poetic. It's a provocation. It's not something that we're ever going to be able to shoot, or that anybody's ever.
Never say never, Jesse.
Yeah, well,
I'm sure the Calpuli Macoyolotzin have it all planned. But one of the things with that final animation that I would just add is that it's not really a repatriation in the present. One of the things that we wanted to do was make this provocation also a suggestion of, well, what would have happened if this object had not been removed from the place where it lay. So if you see the animation, it's kind of a rewind rather than how it would be maybe repatriated today using contemporary technologies and engineering and whatever would be necessary. It's really kind of taking us back as almost with an old VCR where you could press rewind and kind of see it go back in time. No?
Well, not being the pragmatic wet blanket, but to repatriate it today, you'd have to like blow up a lot of freeway overpasses and clover leaves, and I don't know, just logistically, that seems really complicated.
I think the metro is a more problematic issue because there was no metro in Mexico City at the time, and I think that having that kind of weight pass in the city would be quite difficult. It weighs 197 tons, so it's...
You'd want a good engineer to be on board.
And they lost the engineer who helped them bring it there in the first place. So yes,
I think that was one of the most interesting and wonderful moments that I've had since we made this film, which was the day of its premiere at the Cineteca Nacional. There was a committee of people from Coatlinchan that came. I think we had something like 30 different people in the community, including Doña Luz, whose image you showed a little while ago, who was one of my closest friends in Coatlinchan and unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. But I was very worried because on the night of the premiere, the architect, Pedro Ramirez Vázquez, was going to come. The engineer, Enrique del Valle Prieto, was also invited. And we had this committee of people from Coatlinchan. And these people had not seen each other since 1964 when this all took place. And Jesse and I had tried to get particularly Enrique del Valle Prieto to go to Coatlinchan. We wanted to kind of provoke him to go there and film him on site, talking to people there. That was really what we wanted to do in the film. And we were unable to convince him. He was really quite frightened and would not go back there. So I was very worried about putting all of these people in the same room. And once the film finished, it was really great. There was this wonderful exchange where actually Doña Luz turned around, looked Enrique Valle Prieto in the eye and said, "So, engineer, how much would you charge us to bring it back? What do you need to do it?" And they started laughing and started talking. And then they stayed on, I think, half an hour or an hour after the film finished, just kind of chatting. And I thought that was such a great moment.
Oh my
God. And they invited him to come back. And
I think he never did.
Yeah, no, he never did. I think for him it was sort of a site of trauma. And I mean, he was kidnapped essentially. And
or that's how he remembers it, yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't have had no good memories of the place.
No.
But in a way, yeah, I mean, he must have lived there for like several weeks or months while he was trying to prepare for this. And so
much longer. It took them almost a year to prepare the process because of they had to basically build a road to take this thing. They had to reinforce old roads. They had to do the whole structure to be able to weigh it. So he spent a long time coming and going from there. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
He was very young though. He was, I think in his late teens, early 20s. He was a very, very young guy, and he was working for his dad, who was the chief engineer for the project.
Oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. Amazing.
If you see there's a scene in the film where he's looking at footage of himself when he was young, and he was really young. I mean,
Yes.
And Pedro Ramirez Vázquez passed away a few months, actually 2 or 3 months after the premiere. I think that going to see the film was the last time he went out and had sort of in public space before he passed away at 90. Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, incredible.
And there was all of this, I mean, with him it particularly, it was his birthday, the day that this statue was brought to Mexico City. So he kind of celebrated his birthday, and then he also died on the same day.
Oh my God, this is so the secret histories of this stone and the documentary.
You can read all about it in my forthcoming book if I ever finish it. Yeah.
You will, but I'm dying to read that. That sounds amazing. I'm gonna just move forward just because I have one last question and we want to open it up. We do, Jesse, we have a very specific question probably for you, which is, did you use a Panasonic Lumix GH5 or Sony DSC RX10 IV in making the film, or some sort of Canon?
I used an Aton. It's a French camera, A Minima. It's a Super 16 camera, and it's very sort of lightweight but fussy.
Okay, that's exciting. Please, everybody, feel free to put.
Also, we decided to shoot on film, and this was a big decision to make a film, shooting on film in 2010, which is when we were doing most of the shooting, was a difficult decision. I mean, if anybody knows Jesse's work, it would be an obvious no-brainer of why he did that. But also because this film was about heritage, we wanted to give it that kind of material presence and texture.
That's really beautiful. That's really beautiful. And we turn now to this image, which we see on screen, where the caption, the red banner underneath the statue says, "Return me to Quatlin Shan." And it also, 2014, it also engages with current events that were happening at the time. But I think I wanted to kind of get at the broader question about what the film says about a deeper human impulse to imbue monuments with such strong meanings, because the film is both, it's really what you've both been talking about, this hyper local story of one particular town and one monument, but then also stands in for other towns of Mexico. And then how do we make sense of a past that is either our own or monuments that are brought to us or imposed on us by others? So what does the film say about this broader human impulse to imbue monuments with such strong meaning? And I'm going to look at a couple of other images.
Well, this is a particularly, I think, important question in the moment now. I think that we are in the present engaged in a conversation about monuments and monuments commemorating certain pasts that are being either removed or brought down or completely resignified in all sorts of really interesting ways. So this image that you brought up for me was really fascinating, because it's this object that was brought to Mexico City as this kind of bastion of Mexican patrimonio and the state and Mexican modernity, that is being appropriated as a protest sign in the context of the disappearance of the 43 students from Ayotzinapa in 2014. And the object is being reimagined as another disappeared. Mexico is now under has for several decades, but particularly in the recent past, been a place of violent and state-led disappearance of people. And so thinking about this object as another of those disappeared, I think is really interesting. And it's really the only time that I've seen something so public that is blaming the state for theft, not for in very sort of clear terms. No, you have the "Fue el Estado" on the pavement. Yes. That was the slogan that was used with regards to the 43 disappeared. So
it was the state, yeah.
So I think that in, at least to my mind, I think it's very interesting to see that monuments can always be reclaimed and repurposed, even if they were made for something very different. So perhaps bringing this stone down as a marker of the museum, or even returning it to Quatlin Chan, would not allow us to see some of these creative appropriations that are incredibly powerful. I mean, I think this is an incredibly powerful image.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess,
I mean, I don't know how people in Quatlin Chan would feel about that. They probably would prefer for it to be returned.
But I guess I was also thinking about this in relationship to the next image, right? Which in my mind is, it's the monument without the intervention is much less ambiguous, right? It's a Confederate general, right? So it's a monument to white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And as such, it can then be, subverted, and its meaning can be changed with these interventions. The previous image, I think the monument to begin with is a much more ambiguous one, right? Because maybe a lot of museum visitors just think of it, this is a monument to the ancient Mesoamerican past, but
Tlaloc, right? The rain deity.
or it could be a monument to Tlaloc, or it could be a monument, as Sandra said, to Mexican modernity and the technology that was involved to bring it to the museum and take it from, a prone position lying on its back and upright it and all those things. But, is it a god? Is it a goddess? Is it, made by the Teotihuacanos, or is it made by the people from, there's everything is ambiguous about the monument to begin with, even before the intervention, unlike the other one, where I think, what that means is pretty clear, and that it can be subverted. And then this sort of, as these multiply and are transformed, I think there are a whole host of questions that then opens up in terms of, here in California, we've had, I don't know how many monuments to, Padre Aquino and Junipero Serra and to Christopher Columbus that are, decapitated, or their arms are chopped off, or they're just knocked off their pedestals, or some of them have been, sort of preemptively put into storage before people decapitated them. So, rather than simply thinking of iconoclasm, thinking about these other types of interventions, the meaning of the original, to the extent, or the meanings, the possible meanings, a range of meanings of the original monument itself, and the ways in which those can be creatively subverted or repurposed for other ideological ends.
Yeah, this is a really...
And I think even in Coatlinchan, I would argue that the monument became something different by having been taken by the state and repurposed as national patrimony outside of the museum. And I think there's definitely a before and after. And if you look at the, I don't know if you want to go back to the slide of the fountain in the center of the town with the replica. The replica is a replica of the fountain in front of the Museum of Anthropology in a circular base with the monument standing upright in the way that it was done in the museum. Mm-hmm. The Piedra de los Tecomates, as people knew it in Coatlinchan, was lying on its back in a ravine that's about a mile away from this location. So what is being replicated? Is it the object as it was known in Coatlinchan before it was taken away? Is it the newly produced, well, not so newly, 4 decades before, emblem of the Anthropology Museum and the Mexican state? So I think these are the questions that are really interesting to explore and to think about in terms of monuments, replicas, and the kinds of things that they reproduce in terms of the social.
Yeah, absolutely. And here we are coming up on 60 years that it's been out of the community. So there's other layers of, there's not so many people will not even remember it in the community.
Well, I was just thinking as you were showing some of these images, and I was talking about my time there, that so many of the people that I worked with to do this research and to make this film are no longer alive. So I really think that I was able to be there and did this project at the right time. I think most of the people who lived through this that were already adults at this point are no longer around to tell the story. So I mean, people will tell the story in another way, and new generations will remember it differently. But I think that I mean, the first-hand accounts, I think, are no longer available.
Absolutely.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating question here in the chat from Gaurav Pai, which gets at the question of, this question that this is a very complex case that's a little bit different than we are used to. But the current president of Mexico has made a habit out of asking foreign governments and museums to return pre-Hispanic artifacts. For example, when he met with the Pope, he's argued with museums in New York. Is there a way to situate, contrast, and compare the history you talk about with the present? Also, can history be situated in the run-up to the events at the Tlatelolco Plaza during 1968?
Thank you, Gara, for that really great question. Several questions, actually. I think, and I'll answer the last one first. This was one of the first instances in which the Mexican military was deployed against a community in Mexico in the 1960s. So I definitely think it is a precursor, or can be seen as a historical precursor to what happened in 68 under Lopez. This was under Lopez Mateos, and that was the Azordas. But let's say that this was a precursor to the kind of state violence and use of military force that then we saw in Tlatelolco, for sure. With regards to the other question that you ask, I think Mexico, like many other places, has been very good at demanding the return of objects that it considers national patrimony under UNESCO guidelines of heritage laws, etc. But there has been such little discussion in Mexico, if any at all, in terms of the ways in which the Mexican state has appropriated these objects and made them into national collections, removed them from local communities, in many cases actually harming these objects or destroying them. So I wrote recently about the stelas from the classic Maya sites that were removed also in the 1960s to make the Anthropology Museum. And in one particular case, one of these stelas was left abandoned in a river because it was the plane that was supposed to move it didn't show up on the right day. And so they just left it there. And it was, of course, corroded and eroded. This is Stela 11, which is one of the most beautiful stelas in Yaxchilan. So there's a lot of these instances where supposedly these projects to salvage objects or put them in museums actually is destroying these objects, and certainly not taking into account the ways in which they are effectively and historically tied to the locations in which they're found.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this debate has taken place on a sort of global level, right, where the former imperial power, the British Museum has these sculptures from Greece, and when they were removed from Greece, it was a Turkish colony, and the Turks said it was okay, and the Greeks want them back. But this is a different sort of context in that it's all within national boundaries, and then the legality of it and the ethics of it, I think, change.
And also in a place like Mexico where indigenous heritage is considered national heritage. I mean, that is actually by law giving the state authority over these objects and monuments, because there is no sense that there is any kind of there's no recognition of other kinds of sovereignties.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we're trying to minimize the huge problem of objects having been looted from the country, but it does certainly complicate this panorama. There's been so much recent news about the return of objects from former colonial powers, but this really complicates it by also bringing in the question of local versus national interests that are at work. So I think we've actually come to the end of our program. I feel like you'll need to link to this on your website, because there have been so many secret histories of the monolith and the movie that have come to light during this talk. It's been really a delight to talk to you. So thank you to our guests today, Sandra Rosental and Jessie Lerner, for being here with us today. You can find this film. It's being shown right now as part of the Maryland Film Festival in the Parkway Virtual Theater. There's a link earlier on in our chat that you can just scroll up and find that in the chat. A bigger thank you to you, the audience, for sharing this experience with us. We welcome you back for more programs on our social platforms. And for upcoming programming, including artist talks, curatorial lectures, performances, and more, please visit our website at walters.org. But again, thank you again to our guests today, Sandra Rosental and Jessie Lerner, for being here with us today. A big thank you to our digital team for producing this program and for everybody who's been involved in this. But thank you. This was just, for me, just such a amazing experience.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you to the museum and for all of the work that you've done to promote the film. If anybody wants to get in touch with us or wants to know more about the film, in addition to watching it on this link, we have a website. I think we shared it also on the chat, and you can also find us in social media on Facebook as La Piedra Ausente or The Absent Stone. and can continue the conversation. You can ask us questions there. We'll be really happy to answer and to be in contact with all of you. Thank you.
No, and thanks for the opportunity to share the film with all of you guys.